Good evening, Berea College community. On behalf of the Convocation series and the Office of Internships and Career Development, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Envisioning the New World of Careers and Internships for 2021. My name is Amanda Tudor, and I'm the Director of Career Development.
I'm Esther Livingston, Director of Internships, and I am so pleased to be able to welcome our guests and introduce them to you. Joining us this evening is Cruz Vergara, Vice President of Higher Education and Student Success at Handshake. She is leading Handshake's efforts to deepen partnerships with higher ed to ensure greater career success for students. Christine previously served as the Associate Provost and Executive Director of Career Education at Wellesley College, and has held senior level positions and board roles in multiple institutions. Christine is an alumna of the University of Maryland and James Madison University, and is coming to us from her home on the West Coast in San Francisco. So welcome, Christine. Also joining us is Sean Vanderzill, currently the Executive Director of the National Association for Colleges and Employers, also known as NACE. He's been involved with NACE as a member and a volunteer leader for more than 25 years. Sean has also been a longstanding member of SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Managers, and he previously held a series of positions spanning 22 years at the Field Museum in Chicago, most recently as the Chief Human Resource Officer. Sean is an alumnus of Michigan State University and is coming to us from his home in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Both of our guests are nationally recognized, distinguished experts and work on a daily basis with career services staff and students from colleges and universities all across the country, and with employers and recruiters. We're honored that they've made themselves available to talk with us about what we see as a new world for careers and internships. And now, as our conversation flows through different topics, submit questions for our panelists via the Q&A function as we go along, but we won't address them until the latter half of our session, but please feel free to go ahead and submit them. So Amanda, will you kick it off?
Absolutely. Let's start with hiring trends in the job market. Sean, I'd like to begin with you. The pandemic has affected so many May graduates, alumni, seasoned professionals, and as the executive director of NACE, I know that you've been reaching out to so many employers this summer, researching the hiring trends and really finding out what's happening. So fill us in on what is going on, and are employers hiring full-time professionals? Help us understand how this has happened throughout the summer.
Absolutely. Well, first, let me just say hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be engaged in a conversation like this, and hope that you all take something away from it that you can apply to your day-to-day lives and the planning of your careers. So this has been a wild time, as we all know. I'm sure that everyone who's listening right now is thinking about their own personal lives and how things have been impacted, as well as your school lives. Employment has been no different. It has been a really bumpy road for everyone, both in the workplace, those going into the workplace. And we've spent a lot of time talking with our employers and then hearing from career centers also for those employers that we don't reach directly, but what's happening with their students from a full-time employment perspective. And it's all over the board, honestly. I think for me, the positive news that came out of particularly the beginning of the pandemic was for recent graduates, those who were graduating from the class of 20. If they had a job offer upon graduation, there were very few organizations that actually withdrew those job offers. And so it was less than 8% of employers were withdrawing those offers. So for me, that was a really good news story, particularly in these rough financial times when people were being laid off and furloughs and everything all around the states. And so 8% is still a big number and obviously impacted a good number of students who were graduating. The perspective I would give to everyone on where we are with employment and kind of where it's headed really has to do with the industry and the type of position that you might be pursuing. Some industries are faring much better than other industries, and certain kinds of positions are faring much better than others. And there's a wide spectrum of those, and it'd be a big laundry list to go through if we were. I'm sure that there are folks in the audience that represent all of those, that whole spectrum. What we're also hearing preliminarily from employers is that it does look like employment hiring will be down over the next year for new college graduates, in the order of somewhere around 10%, so over previous year. So that is what their current prediction is here in August and early September, right? So things could certainly change. What we've been finding is that our employers are trying to be really optimistic about recovery and where things are headed. And so this really stands true for the really large companies. Smaller companies and medium-sized companies are a little different. So those smaller and medium-sized companies are probably a little more hesitant to put themselves out there and probably have done more holding back and more of the dramatic kinds of things that you hear in the news and that you probably have seen maybe even in your own family or with friends in terms of layoffs and furloughs and those other kinds of impacts. But the large companies are really trying to stay optimistic right now.
Okay, Sean, thanks. This is really good for us to know, a good foundation to start with. Christine, what do you and the Handshake team see in terms of hiring trends? And when you're answering, would you also comment about the findings from the employer and student survey that you sent out in April? Because we're well aware that Handshake was very proactive in their response then.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've actually had a few new surveys since then, so I can kind of speak to those as well. So overall, we obviously, as everybody did across the nation, we saw a huge dip in hiring when COVID first hit in the spring semester. The good news is, at least based on the number of postings that we are seeing in Handshake, that has started to stabilize. It is not going down anymore. It is now stable. In some places, it's even like ticking up just a little bit. However, we are still 40% below where we were this time last year. So just to give you a good sense, across every industry, every sector, it is about 40% less positions than we saw this time last year. But the good news is it is stabilizing. So hopefully it can at least maintain at that level, if not start to grow a little bit as we go into the fall semester. For us, there are 5 industries that we still see fairly active on Handshake. Those industries are healthcare. I'm sure that's no surprise to anyone. You see technology, also no surprise to anybody. Education is actually a surprise to everybody. That actually has been growing. However, I think this actually speaks to Sean's point, which is the roles in which education is hiring for look different than what has historically been the case, right? You're not necessarily seeing a lot of like higher ed administration, or you're not seeing a lot of traditional teachers, but you are seeing more when it comes to those that might be working in ed tech, or those that might be in instructional design positions, right? With the growth of online learning. So the types of roles are shifting a little bit. We are actually seeing some growth in, or I should say minimal growth in nonprofits. So that actually is an industry that is continuing to hire right now. Government is an industry that is continuing to hire right now. And that's also going to be fascinating and so interesting with our election in just a couple of months as well. And then finally, I'll give you a 6th industry, which again is probably no surprise, but it's the financial industry. So those that are interested in going into financial services are still planning on entering the fall recruiting season pretty similarly to how they have before. They're signing up for career fairs, virtual fairs with lots of institutions. They are still planning on interviewing, although not on campus, but virtually, right? Those things are still happening. The financial services, the kind of like consulting services, tech, all of that. So that's generally speaking kind of what we're seeing. And then Esther, you mentioned our survey. So we've done actually a number of different surveys across the board for all of our different partners, and we're seeing some different things. So some of what I just shared with you in terms of the industries actually comes from not only our platform data, but also what we're hearing in some of our surveys with employers. We are also hearing from students that 89% of students are actually willing to take a fully remote job. And I think that's a really interesting one because we got that data at the end of the summer. So we got that at the end of July, early August, as people were for those students that were well in their virtual internships, they had a chance to experience what that was going to be like. And even after experiencing that, they're willing to take a job that's going to be fully remote. And I think that says a lot about the upcoming workforce and some of the trends that we're likely to see that's going to happen across every sector and just more flexible work in general, which also I think is really interesting for your students, because really that means you might have more flexibility to be near family, but to also have a job that historically might have made you move to Chicago or LA or San Francisco or DC. You might not have to do that anymore. And so that potentially could open up more opportunities for you. I think that's particularly interesting. We're also on the employer side seeing that a little over 70%, I think it's 71 or 72% of our employers have invested heavily in a digital recruiting strategy. They're training their teams, they are purchasing software, they're making sure that they're actually redoing their strategy around that. And I think that that is something that is honestly, truly here to stay. So that was a trend that we were seeing with our partners before COVID hit. COVID essentially accelerated all of that. What I think would have happened for 2 or 3 years essentially happened in 2 to 3 months. And I think now that they're investing in doing more of that, you're going to see the digital recruiting strategy stay in many respects, even after COVID is over. So anyway, I could talk your ear off, so I'll stop there. But
we'll come back to that.
Absolutely. Such good information. And let's keep the goodness going with, let's talk about skills and competencies. Sean, would you walk us through the key skills and new competencies that you've been hearing from employers that they're seeking now, probably a little bit different than 2019?
Yeah, I think Christine really started to hit on it, right? Around just the digital platforms people are working on and that notion of flexibility. And then expand that into that remote working environment, right? So more than ever, employers are really looking for individuals, and particularly new graduates, who have super strong communication skills, and specifically oral and written communication skills. It's going to be even more important so than it ever has been, because we're not having currently those face-to-face conversations. It's happening in a really different way, and it's happening in short spurts, and it's happening in strange ways in many ways, because you don't have the same cues that you may when you're in person in a virtual environment. So it's almost like learning a different language. And so those oral and written communication skills become that much more important. Work ethic is critically important, and it becomes even more so in the virtual world, because we don't know what you're doing at home, and so we can't just look over the cubicle and see what's happening. And so, you know, there's this idea that we've got to figure out new systems and ways, but for workers to be able to communicate about their work ethic and to be able to actually demonstrate that work ethic. I would also add a few others, which would be critical thinking, teamwork, and leadership. So those also are really important in this environment. One of the things, though, that always strikes me when I talk about these is that there's often a gap between how important employers think these are and how important students think these are, or how well a student thinks they actually are in these skills versus how an employer thinks they are doing in these particular areas. So to give you an example so that everyone can think about themselves and how they might work on these ideas, students often rate themselves, particularly in the oral and written communication skills area, very high, saying that I've got really great oral and written communication, so I got this, done. I'll tell you, employers, it's one of the lowest ones where they rank students in return. So they're saying the skills aren't quite there. They're not at the level that I need them to be for the workplace. So that means how do you communicate in a business sense? How do you communicate succinctly? How do you communicate friendly, but in a business way? How do you use that business language? Another one would be around that, I find this one interesting, which is digital technology. Students often undercut themselves with the digital technology. So they don't think they actually have quite the skill level that the employer is going to need. But the employers say, no, the students usually exceed my expectations. And so there's a gap in the opposite direction in that particular one. So the message on that to you particular one is don't undercut yourself with the digital technology. Make sure you're communicating it loudly to those employers and letting them know how you use that technology. And I'm certain they're going to be impressed.
Wow, that is great. Thank you so much, because it's we don't want our students guessing at what they think employers want. We want them to really be informed about that. So Christine, what have you seen in this regard?
Yeah, I would essentially plus everything that Sean just said. So I won't repeat all of those, but he's right. Those are definitely things that we are seeing, especially the communication. I will add a couple others though on top of that. And then I actually have a message for the faculty that might be listening to the convocation right now. So the two additional ones I would add is we see a lot around sort of like data analysis, data interpretation. Your fluency with data is really, really important right now across any sector and across any industry. It doesn't matter whether you're going into nonprofits or education or business or tech, healthcare, everybody needs somebody that understands how to really deal with a large amount of data, to analyze it, to interpret it, to make sense of it, and then to be able to actually pull out what are the nuggets here? What are we learning? How should that inform our decisions moving forward? So being able to make sense of data, if that is something that you have or something that you wish to learn more about, that is going to be incredibly marketable for you across any industry. So that's one. The second one I would also add is Excel. I know this seems really, really basic, but again, across any industry, we are seeing employers that just want honestly pretty basic Excel skills. So if you do not feel like you are super good at Excel, it is worth your time and energy to actually teach yourself some of the basics. Make sure you know how to do formulas. Make sure you're able to do some macros, like kind of get up to sort of like beginner to almost intermediate level in Excel. That again is going to serve you really, really well, because regardless of whether you go into being a consultant or you go into a school, you're going to end up needing to use Excel or Google Sheets, whichever, in some way, shape, or form that's going to help your work. And then the message to faculty that I would have is it is super important for students to be able to translate the skills that they're gaining from your classes to the work world. And so employers, as we all know, use different language than the language that is used in academia or in higher education. And sometimes for students, I mean, I've worked with thousands of students over the course of the 4 different institutions that I've worked at. And I am always amazed that students, to Sean's point, they undersell themselves in terms of what they've learned in a particular class or in a particular project. And they're like, well, I don't know, I think maybe I have this skill. And they don't realize that through the course of that particular class, they've actually learned teamwork, or they've learned how to problem solve, or they've learned how to deal with difficult people because half their group didn't pull their weight on that assignment, right? I know there are students that are nodding right now to that particular example. And so make sure as a faculty member, when you give an assignment, you have put so much thought and energy into the pedagogy for how you are teaching that assignment or how you put that group project together. Just explain to them for 30 seconds, hey, I'm making this a group assignment and I'm giving you a group grade because in the work world, you have to work together as a team and everybody gets graded together, essentially. You're not going to get individual grades, right? If that happens to be your reason. Or I'm asking you to do this oral presentation because I want you to be able to practice conveying your ideas in a clear, succinct, concise manner. You're going to need to be able to do that when you get into the work world. And just make that direct connection for your students because they sometimes won't know that that's why you're doing the things that you're doing. But helping them to do that makes it also easier for them to think about the applicability when they're in their interview.
Amen, sister. We're going to transition now. I mean, that's just such, this information, we thank you both. It's so great and so helpful. But we're going to shift now to talk about internships, which is my personal favorite topic. Last spring, we saw many employers withdraw their offers for internships, or they closed, they couldn't help it, or they converted those internships to remote experiences at the last minute. So there was a real range of which were good ones and which weren't, And then Berea followed by canceling internships that were sponsored by the college. So we want to help our students make up for lost time this coming year as much as we can. We're going to have some different options for them, remote options and micro internships and all these things. But Christine, as we look forward to 2021, what have you gathered from employers in regard to next summer's internship opportunities? And then what advice would you give for students who will be applying for summer internships?
Yeah, so honestly, this really varies industry by industry. For the sheer majority, time will tell. We honestly don't know yet exactly what summer internship season is going to look like for next year. And there's a lot in terms of obviously the pandemic and the health crisis that is going to impact or not impact in some ways what that could potentially look like. What I can tell you is that the employers that are recruiting in the fall, that historically recruit for internships in the fall, like financial sector, like consulting, like tech, many of them are still planning on doing their normal recruiting. They might have a slightly smaller like analyst class, for example, but they're still planning on doing their internship recruiting. So for students that happen to be interested in those areas, you should continue to go through the process like you normally would and get ready and make sure you're visiting Amanda and Esther and that you're participating in all of the events and all of the things that they have to offer, because that is your step. That is one thing you can do to get closer to an internship. For those of you that are interested in the industries that I essentially did not just mention, I don't know. I actually don't know what that is going to look like because those employers typically post their positions in the spring. And so at the moment, it's kind of an unknown for many of those employers. And even if you were to ask them, I'm sure many of them would say, well, we got to watch and see how, the third and fourth quarter of this year goes and see how our business is continuing to be fluid, and then they'll make a decision about whether or not they're able to do that. So I think there's still a lot of question marks when it comes to exactly what internships will look like for 2021. And you asked a second part of the question, but I have already forgotten.
It was advice that you would give to students who are, as they're applying for summer internships.
Yeah, so I'd give you a few different pieces of advice. I think one is, this sounds really trite, but please don't get discouraged. I know that it's really hard being a student right now, and especially if you're getting close to graduating or you're a junior and you're like, this is my 1 year that I really wanted to do an internship. I know that it can feel really discouraging. But sometimes job searching is like dating, and nobody wants to date the desperate person or the person who's really negative, right? And so as a student, it's important to try and stay as positive as possible when you're going through the process. And if you're finding yourself having a hard time doing that, I hope that you will reach out to the Career Center, you will reach out to your roommates, you will reach out to your parents, you'll reach out to whoever your support network is to be like, hey, can I just be really negative and vent with you so that when I'm actually going through this process and I'm talking to employers and I'm trying to network, I don't bring all that negativity to the people that ideally might be able to help me get a connection. So that's the first thing, is like your mindset and your attitude actually makes a really big difference in the process. That's not just during like tough economic times, that's always, but I know it's harder for people during this particular period in time. The second thing is I would focus on controlling what you can within your sphere of influence. So you can't control the pandemic, you can't control the economy. Don't stress yourself out about those things because you can't do anything about it. What you can do is focus on the things that are within your control. So one is you actually have a career center. Use your career center. You know, for many people, many students, when you graduate, if you want to see a career coach, you're going to pay like $200 to $300 an hour to see somebody. You have that for free right now. So everybody should be making appointments. Everybody should be going to their career center and making sure that they are getting the help that they need to process through this whole journey and this whole process. Another thing that you have is obviously Handshake. We're a partner with you all. So if you have not logged on to Handshake yet, that is something that you can do from the comfort of your room. You don't even have to leave your home. Make sure you actually activate your account, and then make sure you actually fill out your profile. That is another thing that you can spend the time doing right now. We know through our research that when a student completes their profile, they are 80% more likely to receive messages from employers. That is huge. That's a huge margin. So make sure that you're doing everything you can to actually give yourself the best chance to be found. And then lastly, I would say make sure that you continue to network. So if you're looking for an internship, one of the best things you can do right now is to continue building relationships with alumni and with other folks that are in your industry of interest or in the job roles that you're really interested in, so that you can actually hear about opportunities that might be coming down the road before they're even posted. So that when it gets posted and you apply, somebody might be able to put 2 and 2 together between having met you and your application. And that's really, really important. So again, the Career Center can help you with that as well. But I'll leave it there. Those are some of the tips that I would give.
That's wonderful. Sean, do you want to add something to that? Are you ready to say more?
Sure. I can talk just a little bit about what happened this summer. So about 20% of internships were withdrawn from folks who had internships in place for the summer, which was a real tragedy. For those that went forward, they were all over the board in terms of what actually happened. And for the vast majority of them, they were either they were delayed, they were shortened in length, or some of them didn't happen, they still got paid. And so we found that there were a number of employers that actually did that. I say those few things to let you know that the likelihood of all of that happening again probably isn't going to be very high. Because it was at a high cost for those employers. They were learning and they were trying to figure it all out, but they're probably not going to do that again. And so to Christine's earlier point, we're in an unknown period because we just don't know how it's going to play itself out over the course of this year. But what we do know is that large employers particularly use internship programs as a branding experience. They really want to bring students through because they know that it's about the life cycle of their company and bringing in fresh talent over the years, that you are a potential employee of theirs one day, and all of the people that you touch are potential employees as well. And so they certainly don't want to lose that because particularly if they think their company is going to have an upswing at some point. And so they're thinking through that very clearly. But to Christine's point, they're not being very forward right now and putting forth how they're going to go about doing everything and what exactly they're going to do. So it's a little bit of a wait and see game right now. I guess what I would add in terms of that advice piece would be 2 additional things related to that, which would be take advantage of the opportunities that are in front of you when they are in front of you. So if you are hesitant about something, you see someone on campus who's starting to interview, if it's an employer for whether it's a full-time job or an internship, just go for it because you don't know if that opportunity is going to be there in the spring. So if it intrigues you, if you have some interest in it, I say go for it. And also really think broadly about your skills and your interests. Oftentimes people get really tunnel vision in their job search. And they start to think about themselves in a particular job, in a particular industry, in a particular kind of employer, and they really limit themselves in terms of the scope of where their search goes. But in fact, as many of us who have been in the workforce for a long while know, your career is a journey, and it takes many twists and turns. And I had no idea I'd be in the job that I am in today when I graduated from college. Didn't even fathom it. And I had three other turns in the way. And so I say that to say it's about your interests and it's about your skills, and it's about applying those along the way and being flexible enough to see that opportunity in front of you where you can take advantage of your interests and take advantage of your skills as it comes about.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Christine, we mentioned remote internships, and we know that they're probably going to be here to stay, certainly for now, but likely on, going forward in the future. So what would you say are maybe the top 3 or 4 best practices for students to be able to maximize remote internship experiences?
Like once they're in the experience, how to make it
Yes, once they're in it, not the application stage, but if they have an offer for that.
Yeah, I think once you have a remote internship, Sean talked about this at the beginning around how important communication is. And so one of the first things you can do as a student is to make sure that you're communicating with your supervisor. Hopefully you have a supervisor. So that's step 1. If you don't have a supervisor, find out who that person is and who is sort of responsible, because that's going to be a really important touch point for you. One of the first things you should do within your first week is make sure you have a one-on-one with that person so you can be very explicit about what the expectations are. I like to tell students, make the implicit explicit, because now you're remote, you're not going to see your team or your boss nearly as frequently as you would have if you were in the same office and you just happen to run past each other, you happen to chit chat by the kitchen, so on and so forth. None of that is going to happen anymore. So you might have to explicitly have conversations about, what are your expectations on email communication? Or if my company uses Slack, do you require that I am responding within a few hours or within 24 hours? Does email need to be responded to within the same day? If you text me, do I need to respond to that? Does that mean it's urgent, right? How do you want me to reach out to you if I have an update or a question? Do you want me to save it for my weekly one-on-one? Or do you want me to just send you an email anytime I think of something, or send me a Slack, right? Different supervisors have different preferences. And knowing that up front is going to make your life a lot easier. You also want to make sure you're clarifying your role in different types of meetings. So you won't have met everybody when you first start, and they're probably going to have you go to an all hands meeting, which might be like a full staff meeting, or you might go to a team meeting, or you might go to a client meeting. You should ask, is your expectation that I have my camera on and that I speak and join in the conversation? Is your recommendation that I have my camera on, I stay muted and I'm listening, right? Should I be taking notes? Like, what is your expectation of how I engage? Because that might actually look different across each of these different meetings. And it might also be different week 1 through 3 versus week 6 through 10, right? And so you kind of want to talk through those pieces. It'll make your life as a student a lot easier, and it will allow you to actually excel and to meet expectations or exceed expectations if you know what those expectations are. So I always say the first and foremost is communication, and make the implicit explicit. The second thing that I would also encourage you to do, and I'll leave it at these 2 major pieces, is take the initiative to actually meet people. Again, it's going to be harder when you're remote to necessarily build the relationships that you would have naturally built with, say, other interns or with your teammates that are full-time. So make sure you reach out and you take the initiative to ask if somebody might be willing to do like a 30-minute virtual coffee chat, so you can learn more about their career or how they got to work at this particular company, or what advice they have for you as a college student or as an intern. People love to give advice. They love to be able to talk about what their career path might have been. So don't hesitate to do that. More people than not will say yes, and they will take you up on that. And it's a great way for you to begin to build that rapport.
Yeah, those themes of being proactive and being very intentional. I mean, that takes us back to, let's talk about networking again, because feeling like there are tools out there, but we're not really sure which tools are the most effective. I'd love for both of you to just talk about your impressions of LinkedIn. You know, many of our students are on there with free memberships, but something that our Career Center is able to really support is looking at premium, if that is something that they would like to have access to. And then also talking about if student memberships in professional associations are helpful.
Sean,
I
you want to
think,
do that first?
yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. Um, just in general, I would say around networking, it's really important. It's a really important thing to do. One, it helps you to learn about the world. And two, it will help you to learn about yourself and help you to understand what you might be getting yourself into one day or what you don't want to get yourself into one day based upon the kinds of things that you're learning. And so that's what I would use it as a learning experience. And I would think of, when I think of networking, I know it's a really hard thing to do because you think about how do I even make that reach out? You're really putting yourself out there in a vulnerable way. But I'll tell you what, particularly if you're a student, use the student card. Let those people know that you're networking with, that you are a student and that you're just trying to learn about the world. And so use that to your advantage while you've got it. Because I'll tell you, it's much more difficult once you break out of that, when you become a much more seasoned professional, to do the same kind of networking that you might be able to do as a student. Because people truly do look at it as a learning experience for you, and they look at it as a giving back for themselves, because they think of themselves in your shoes. And so, you know, here I am, an alumni from the same place, and I can remember those days and feeling lost and scared and not knowing what I was going to do next. And sure, I'll help you out. I'll talk with you about this job that I'm in, this company that I work for. And so please use that to your advantage and think of it as that learning experience. And there are lots of ways to do that. I think that LinkedIn is a really good resource to use, but do know there are millions of professionals using it. So they're using it for the same ways that you're going to use it. So you've got to figure out how to stand out with that. And you've got to figure out how to inject your own personal story and why the person that you're trying to network with will want to pause to talk with you. And so that means using your personality. That means, you know, not just being very, how do I say, robotic about how you go about it, or giving canned reach outs to those individuals. They need to be personalized, those reach outs. You need to let that person know why you're reaching out to them specifically. Because if it doesn't contain that, the likelihood of them reaching back out to you probably is not high. Because if they're like me, I'm receiving many LinkedIn requests a day from a variety of people who want to talk with me about a variety of things. And I can't get back to them all. And so frankly, I'm prioritizing those and trying to figure out, you know, what's in it for me at the same time that I'm trying to help someone on the other end. And so if I can tie those two things together very quickly, I'm going to do that. And I think that using LinkedIn is a really smart way, particularly in reaching out to your alumni. Also thinking about those industries that you might not already have connections to, and thinking about the kinds of jobs that you aspire to be in. Maybe it's not a job that you will go into immediately upon graduation, but it's a job you aspire to one day. And that's a great way to use that LinkedIn network. And professional associations would be very similar. And so if there's a way to reach into those networks of professional associations, I really would encourage you to do that as well.
Definitely. I think what Sean said is very apropos. I think in addition to, so I actually, your question, Amanda, about sort of like, should a student use LinkedIn Premium versus the free LinkedIn? I actually don't have an opinion on that. I've never used the premium LinkedIn, so I actually have no idea what premium LinkedIn looks like or what you might get by using it. I hear it's great for people that have done it, and so if you happen to be able, if the Career Center can actually help students to get that, by all means, take advantage of that. Why not? That would be fantastic. So you might as well try. It doesn't hurt, right? And so I definitely encourage students to use LinkedIn. I would also say, so on Handshake, you actually can peer message students as well within the Handshake network. So I would actually encourage you, you might want to use Handshake as like your stepping stone to then reaching out to more seasoned professionals on LinkedIn. You can essentially like test it out with your peers, get a little bit more comfortable, right? And then once you feel more comfortable, then you can also go find more seasoned alums or more seasoned professionals in your field to then test it on. I always think it's great to kind of sometimes test it out a little bit, especially if I'm nervous or if I've never really done an informational interview or reached out to somebody before. Start with somebody that feels, quite frankly, less threatening. Right? Like the stakes are lower. And so another student, another peer, it can often make you feel more comfortable in that conversation as you're learning what questions you might ask or how you interact with them over the Zoom call or the phone call, and sort of what that looks like. So in Handshake, you can actually, I actually recommend in Handshake, you might go to reviews first and read some of the reviews that students have left on different companies based on their internship experience or their work experience. And then if you really like what somebody wrote, you could go look for them and then message them, and you could use their review as a way to start the conversation, right? Hi, Sean, I saw your review of AT&T. I thought it was really interesting. I would love to actually learn more about the interview process. Would you be willing to chat with me, right? It's specific. It shows that you took time to read something that he wrote and why it is you're reaching out to him. Right. And so that might be an easier way to just initially begin. I always tell students too, it's partially a numbers game because people are so busy like Sean. And so for every 10 individuals that you reach out to, you're maybe going to hear back from 5. Okay, that's 50%. You're maybe going to hear back from 50%. Of the 5 people you talk to, you're maybe going to feel like you're really connected with like 1 or 2 of them. Okay, so I just want to manage expectations here. When we say networking and we say like, go find people to talk to and do informational interviews, it doesn't mean that every single person you reach out to is 1, has to respond to you, or 2, you're going to really like them and want to stay in touch. You're not. Some people are just going to give you maybe a few good pieces of information. You'll use it. It'll help you inform better questions for the next person, but you might not actually keep in touch, and that's okay. They don't expect it just as much as you might not expect it. So be polite, take what you can out of the conversation, but take a little pressure off of yourself and give yourself a little grace while you're going through the process.
Yeah,
Christine, I love that. I think you gave some really great advice. And the only, I thought that was really great. The only thing I would add to it is if there's someone, give yourself your own grace that like everyone you reach out to isn't going to get back to you. Just know that, just know it off the board. But if there is a person or people that you were really super duper hoping you could get to, don't feel bad about reaching back out to them again, and do so in a clever way or a fun way or a nice way to say, hey, I know you're super busy, but I really would love to talk with you. And here's why. And, you know, if you don't know the person, what's the harm, right? As long as you're not embarrassing yourself, put yourself out there, because the only thing that can come, there's nothing bad that can come back to you. And so remember that as you're going through it, give yourself your own grace as you go through it.
Thank you both so much. I have one more question, and I just feel like we really need to pay attention to this. The pandemic has magnified the deep inequalities that have existed in our nation for a very long time. As you both have been getting to know Berea College, our rich history, the foundation that we stand on, valuing all people, honoring every one of our unique and diverse members of our community, we're wondering how employers are responding in this moment. Have you seen renewed efforts to really create more fairness or opportunities for all in work environments and in hiring practices?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I definitely have. I would say 100% there is a renewed energy, there's a renewed commitment. across the board. And this again spans across every industry, every sector, large, small, medium-sized companies, definitely seeing that commitment towards diversity and inclusion, and wanting to have a more diverse population of applicants so that their companies and the people that they hire can better reflect the communities in which they serve or in which they are partners with, right? So 100% seeing that across the board. I think, to be perfectly honest, time will tell which companies are really serious about it, because I think there's a difference between a desire to recruit diverse talent and then a desire and an ability to actually retain diverse talent. And those are two different things. And it also takes two different sets of strategies and two different skill sets for a company to be able to do that. And so I think as Berea students are graduating and looking at these opportunities, it's also an opportunity for you to be critical and smart about the types of questions that you're going to ask employers and what it is that matters to you and what you're looking for. What is the culture that you want to see when you walk into a workplace? What do you expect about how different voices will be at the table or will not be at the table? What's your expectation around the amount of time or tenure you might need to be somewhere before you are seen as credible? And so I think those are all realities of the types of work environments we all have been in and continue to be in. I definitely think overall, employers are aiming to improve. There is definitely a movement in that direction. I think the speed at which that is going to happen or the lengths to which that will happen for different employers will vary. And I think as students, it's part of your responsibility to think through for yourself, what is your threshold? What is it that you're willing to live with versus what is it that you feel like you need to see? But our employers, at least the ones working with Handshake, are keenly aware that both students and universities are asking more questions about that and to be more clear about what their plans are to diversify their board, for example, or diversify their leadership team or their company or organization. One question I always tell students, it's one of my favorite questions personally to actually ask in an interview. And I think it's often quite insightful and interesting to sort of hear people's answers. But I always like to ask a series of people that I'm interviewing with at the same company, what's one unwritten rule in this organization? And I always find that you learn a lot about what people, how sort of what the culture is, how people operate, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And I personally also sometimes like to ask the question of how does a decision get made here? What does that look like? Because I think that also tends to give you a lot of color into who are the people at the table. Is it very hierarchical, or is it more about tenure or a different kind of influence that tends to lead its way? So those are just two questions for me that I personally really like to use that gives me a gauge of a company's sort of culture.
I would echo everything again that Christine said. Everything was right on from what we're learning. We're just finishing up a couple of surveys related to this question. And what we're finding is that there's an overwhelming sense of movement and a renewed sense of commitment, particularly towards racial justice. However, having said that, what we're finding, at least in the preliminary answers, similar to what Christine said, is that it's probably not as fast as I would like to see it in terms of where the dollars are actually going to make change happen in the organization. So what we're finding is that companies are being really quick to think about their hiring processes, as Christine said. So they're thinking about it very seriously about making sure that they have a diversified pool and diversified candidates, applicants to employees coming through the pipeline. But the other elements of what equity means in an organization aren't quite moving at the same pace or at the same commitment quite yet. That's not to say that they're not going to. I think it probably has a lot to do with the moment in time we're in. We have this pandemic happening that is COVID. We have this pandemic that's happening that is around racial justice. And overlaying all of that is a financial crisis. And so there are these pressures that are building that folks are going to need to adjust to together. And I think it will catch itself up, to Christine's point, but for different companies and for different reasons, it's going to be at different time periods. But we certainly are seeing that commitment on the hiring side for certain. And I would also just reiterate what Christine said, is I think that what that means from a student perspective applying for a job, it means if those issues are important to you, and you really want to be in an organization that values certain things, let's say equity or racial justice, or all of the issues together, then you need to do your homework and find ways to get to what those companies are truly doing. And there are ways to do that. And I loved Christine's questions, because they can, those questions can get underneath some of the facade that you may see during an interview process, or you may see on a website. So finding those clever ways is really important in this world.
Thank you all for those insights. It's such an important topic. We just really appreciate that. But we need to switch over and take some of our questions from students now. And we had some that were submitted to us in advance. And the first one is from a GST 101 course, which is first-year students. And it says that at Berea, we are, completing this rigorous liberal arts education. And they wanted to know, what is the value of the liberal arts education? And Christine, this was for you, because they know you came from Wellesley, so.
Yes, I'm so glad. I was so excited. This is wonderful. Oh my God, there is so much value in the liberal arts education. And I'm going to tell you this, as someone, I'm 36 years old now. And if I could actually go back and rethink about my own education, I would actually very seriously think about going to a small liberal arts education, a small liberal arts institution. And the reason is, the older I have gotten, the more senior I have gotten in roles, and the more places I have worked, the more I see the value of the liberal arts shining through in the people that I work with. The people with a liberal arts background are often the ones that are able to take vast amounts of information, consume it, make sense of it, and then figure out a very clear and concise way to make recommendations or proposals or suggestions about possible solutions. And they're able to see across disciplines what that might look like. The reality is, our world's biggest issues, they're gnarly, and they are not singular in discipline, right? It's not a sociology issue. It is not a chemistry issue, right? When you think about hunger, and you think about racial injustice, and you think about energy, these are issues that span across, quite frankly, every discipline. And the only way in which we're actually going to solve some of those the world's problems is to, or make progress in them at least, is to be able to work well with individuals across all of those areas, to know enough that we don't know all of the answers, and to ask the right questions, and then to take that information and synthesize it in ways that we can really make use of it. So that's what you're getting when you have a liberal arts education. And it's a matter of articulating that. I will also say the liberal arts majors or graduates that I have worked with have historically always been the best writers. And so again, back to Sean's first point early on in the conversation, that is going to serve you so well, because employers can, a lot of times you'll hear them say, well, look, I can teach them some of the hard skills. I can't teach somebody who's like 22 years old now how to write, right? So taking the time to really focus on that while you're getting your liberal arts education is super important, and understanding that it's about asking the right questions and understanding things from multiple perspectives.
Okay.
I'm so excited about that question.
All right, Sean, the next one's for you. It is also from one of the GST 101 classes, or GST 100. I think I'm saying that wrong. It says, many Berea students want to work for service-oriented nonprofit organizations. What specific advice do you have for those students?
Yeah, I would say be patient with the nonprofit environment and their hiring processes, because it's not going to be the same as large corporations, and it's going to be a lot looser. And so as you're thinking about a position with a nonprofit, one, as you're entering, it sounds like this is a first year student, right? So as you're thinking about going through your program, start volunteering now. Start doing internships now. Start being involved in your community now if you're not, if you want to be involved with a nonprofit long term, because that's going to demonstrate to them that this is the kind of place that you want to be in. And so you're going to be that much further ahead by demonstrating that on your resume, that these issues are important to you. And so I would start there. And then as you go through processes, whether it's an internship process or it's a full-time job opportunity process, it's not going to be like all your friends who are applying for accounting jobs. It's going to be very different. And you'll have to have a little more patience with those nonprofits and be a little more creative about getting into the interview, particularly through that networking scheme that we talked about earlier.
Okay. We also had a question from Amanda's class. She teaches a class on career readiness, and it's all seniors in that class. Amanda, can you ask that question? Can you pose that question?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, for a person like a career counselor or a high touch career or occupation like social work, you know, these occupations, like you said earlier, depend on those one-on-one interactions, in-person cues and interactions. And we were just wondering if you'd heard from employers about how the virtual world, the transition to working virtually was happening. Any thoughts or comments about that?
Yeah, well, I'll actually say I was just reading an article yesterday that I thought was really fascinating about how the mental health industry has moved to telehealth.
Telehealth, yes.
And that's actually been really interesting, because I actually remember when I was at Mason about, oh my gosh, was it almost 10 years ago? When I was at about 8 years ago, when I was at Mason, I remember we had a new director for counseling and health services. And as she came on, one of the things that she talked about was, you know, we might start doing remote appointments, because we think we'll be able to reach more students. It might allow us to also scale. We might do some group appointments, things like that. And I remember at the time, everybody was so against and resistant to what she was saying, because they were like, no, those are things that have to be done in person. You can't possibly do that virtually, right? And she's like, no, I really think that's like the future of where things are going. And little did she know that she was like well ahead of her time. And I actually left Mason and went to Wellesley shortly after. So I actually don't know what she ended up implementing in counseling services, because that wasn't specifically my area. But I remember her saying, like, this is really where things are going. And so it was fascinating to read this article and to actually see that, particularly during this pandemic, not only did that all switch to virtual and people realized, wow, this actually is very possible and it's even easier in some cases, but people saw, a lot of psychologists and counselors actually saw their numbers increase because more people needed that, especially during 2020, right? With everything that's going on. And so I think that, along with even just normal healthcare, many of us have apps now. So you want an appointment with your doctor, you can actually just call the on-call person. They're going to call you right back. It's like a Zoom call on your phone. So I think it is really interesting to see how virtual and remote work is even infiltrating positions where typically you would have thought you have to be in person. Well, we're learning you don't actually have to anymore. And so I think it speaks again to, I'll go back to something else Sean said, which is flexibility, and just making sure that you're thinking about your skills in the most flexible ways, because I think our employers are also thinking about how do you do things in more flexible ways.
Thanks. Thomas, I see that we're at our time, but there are 3 more questions in the chat that we have to answer. There's a bunch of questions in there, but there are 3 that we have to answer. Can we have 5 more minutes? Okay, thank you. One of the questions is, what are some challenges that international students are facing when applying for internships and jobs? How do recruiters look at foreign backgrounds?
Yeah, this is a difficult one in the environment that we're in, and so we're really going to need to, because there's some hesitancy right now, right, with travel restrictions, not understanding what the government's doing or not doing, how they're going to proceed, et cetera. So it's absolutely one that everyone is holding their breath about, and I know, people like me and others, we are working really, really hard behind the scenes to try and ensure that international students have equal opportunity here to do the things that they need to do to pursue their education and everything that's involved with that, which includes those internship opportunities. I think it's a little too soon to know still, as we were talking about just the general internship landscape, how that's going to impact this coming summer internship slew. But maybe Christine, you have a little more insight from what you're learning on your side.
No, it's actually very accurate it's very on par with what you just said too.
Okay.
Okay, I do have a question here that says, what about future entrepreneurs who have no desire to work for someone else in their lifetime?
Well, this is a great time for you. Yeah, this is a great time for you. The world is your oyster, and I think that's also that's an excellent point. That these are times when people are reinventing themselves, and so if you're a person that's about invention and about figuring out how you can be your own boss and how you can create your own world. This is it. We are in it. We are in a moment of complete change. And so I say to you, seize that moment, find those ins, figure out where the gaps are and fill the gap. You can do it. This is the time to do it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I would just send all the encouragement your way.
I love it. I would also just say, if you're thinking about starting a startup, the first most important question you can ask yourself is, what problem am I solving? Like, you have to be crystal clear about what is the problem that you see and how do you envision your thing, whether it's a product or a service or whatever, is going to solve that problem, because that is going to be the pitch essentially that you're going to have to give over and over again. It is also the motivation that has to drive you through a lot of hard times. It is hard to be an entrepreneur. And I am not one, but I work for one. And I know how hard it has been for the co-founders of Handshake to go through this journey. And it takes grit and it takes persistence. So I make sure to start there, but then also make sure to network with other co-founders and other people that are in the startup space so that they can give you a lot of insight into all the language and the jargon and everything that goes into actually starting your own business.
Okay, I'll give you just one more from the student Q&A. Well, I'll give you two. One of them is, do you think that remote internships will carry as much weight as in-person internships? And then the other question is, what about students? Do you have any advice for students who might want to work abroad during this pandemic?
I'll take the first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Either or.
I think remotely understands what's going on. Employers are certainly not going to hold that against you. And quite frankly, if they were, I would really question whether or not I want to work for that employer. So do not worry about that at all. I think you are absolutely fine. It's more about being able to show both what you learned and what you contributed in that remote internship. So just focus on those two things.
I love that, Christine. That's absolutely spot on. In terms of the international, I hate to keep repeating this, but it's just too early to know for the international. I think you're going to have a really hard time finding one right now for the summer months or even the winter or spring months because of travel restrictions, frankly. And so folks are just not going to be willing to take that kind of risk for those international opportunities right now. But perhaps things will change over the coming months. And so we'll have to see how quickly vaccinations come into play and how quickly other countries are willing to allow us back in. All of those things are going to play into it. And let's all hope together that it's a lot sooner than later.
Yeah. Well, this has been absolutely great. So on behalf of the entire Berea College community, I want to express our gratitude to you both for sharing your time and your expertise this evening. We want to end on a really hopeful and positive note, which I think this whole session has been. But this is our last question. In what ways could you see this moment in history? Would it be viewed as a golden opportunity?
Yeah, I would just say, look, this is new to everybody, right? And so it's new to you too. Experiment, think outside the box, seize the moment to do the things that you want to do, but think about it in a virtual way while we're in the virtual world. Don't let the virtual world stop you from progressing on your own goals and building those competencies and skills that you need for the future. So think really creatively about how you can obtain those competencies and skills and experiences in this virtual world. Don't let it stop you, because there are lots of creative ways and things that you can do. And I hope that you'll seize this opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. And I would just say, I'll actually tell you something that I just last week was telling my 7-year-old. Focus on the positive, right? It's really easy in our day-to-day to kind of get entrenched in what's not working or what didn't go well, what I didn't like, and instead take every opportunity, even the smallest one, to sort of focus on, well, what's at least one positive thing that came out of this, right? And so I made him say, well, what if mommy takes away your iPad? What is one positive thing that comes from that? And forced him to have to think about it, right? And he, without missing a beat, he was like, I get to do more active things with my body, right? And so I highly encourage all of us, whatever the small thing is, to force ourselves to have to get in that mental mode and practice of like, what is that one positive thing that could come out of this, or that is a result of this? So focus on the positive.
Well, we appreciate your insights, and thank you once again for talking with us tonight. I'm sure if we were in Phelps Stokes, where we normally have convos, you would be getting a standing ovation right now. So thank you so much.
Let me just bring this, let me extend my thank you to you all. So Christine and Sean, thank you so much for that insightful presentation. I want to thank, of course, Esther and Amanda for all of their work. And of course, I want to really mention the people behind the scenes. So Kyle and Mackenzie, who are providing technical support tonight, and all of you who are watching, all 112 of you who are left. I hope you can join us. Next week, we'll have a fantastic ensemble. Third Coast Percussion from Chicago are playing at the same time, and it's going to be live streamed on YouTube, and you can find the information on our homepage. There will be a link. So everyone stay safe and be well, and until we see each other again, take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.